Hello everyone, and welcome to the next edition of the Holland Land Office Museum's Artifact Video Series. My name is Ryan Duffy, and I'm the director of the museum. And this week we are going to talk about probably one of the most famous Americans ever and his connection to Batavia and Genesee County. Now, if you look behind me, you'll see the portrait of someone very familiar to just about everyone, and that is Abraham Lincoln, even though this was done before he grew the beard. But believe it or not, Abraham Lincoln actually has some connections to Batavia and Genesee County. In fact, he visited the area at least twice and actually made quite a few connections in the area. Now, the first time Abraham Lincoln comes through Batavia and Genesee County is on his inaugural tour before he becomes president. So this would have been the very early part of 1861, and his train actually came through Batavia, though we don't believe that it actually stopped in any way, but he made his way through. Now, there's some of you that may be familiar with a book that was written in 1976 by a woman named Ida Hoyt Chamberlain called Lincoln's 15 Lost Hours, which she tells a story in which Lincoln actually stayed at her family's home in Alexander. Now, there is some reason to believe that this story is not entirely true or isn't based completely in fact, as we don't have any confirmation that Lincoln stayed anywhere in the area on that inaugural tour. But in that story it says that Lincoln spent time at her family home in Alexander and stayed the night and on his way to his next train going farther east through New York and eventually down to Washington, D.C. From what we know, it seems that he stayed in Buffalo and then took the train farther east, making stops along the way. Now, Lincoln's next time is on a much more somber note and is at the end of his presidency. Abraham Lincoln was assassinated on April 15, 1865, while watching a play in Ford's Theater by John Wilkes Booth. However, over the next few weeks, his body would be transported across the United States to his final resting spot in Springfield, Illinois. This would be known as Lincoln's funeral train. Now, this train began in Washington, D.C. and worked its way up the East Coast and then across New York State, through Ohio and Indiana, and finally into Illinois. Now, the funeral train traveled across New York State from Albany to Buffalo, and it was actually transported by the engine, the Dean Richmond, which was the personal locomotive of Dean Richmond, who was the president of the New York Central Railroad and also a resident of Batavia. Now, Mr. Richmond was actually a pretty close friend with Mr. Lincoln, even though they were split on their political ideas, Lincoln being a Republican and Richmond being a Democrat. But they got to know each other and saw each man as a very well-respected individual. So as a result, Richmond actually donated his personal locomotive to pull the Lincoln funeral train as it made its way along the New York Central through New York State. Now, it stopped at all the major cities, but due to the fact that with Dean Richmond's pull and they were using his locomotive, it actually stopped in Batavia, and not just passing through the station as it did many other smaller stations, but it actually stopped for about 10 or 15 minutes for mourners to come and see Lincoln's body and the train. Now, it stopped in Batavia on April 27th, 1865, and it came in about 5:30 in the morning, and a few hundred people actually gathered by the New York Central Station to pay their respects to the fallen president. And it was at this time that Lincoln's final pass through Batavia and Genesee County happened on his way to his final resting place in Springfield, Illinois. Now, besides the portrait behind me, we actually have a few other things related to Lincoln and his time passing through Batavia that I'd like to show you. So here we actually have a framed letter that is reported to have a piece of the bandage that was used to treat Lincoln's wound after he was shot on April 15th, 1865. It was supposedly used by a Dr. Franklin A. Bushy, who was one of the surgeons on hand, and then it passed through many hands until it eventually made it to us. So that's a very interesting piece that is connected right to the assassination of President Lincoln. We have a memorial ribbon that were handed out after Lincoln's passing, and these would have been along all of the stops and even here in Batavia. and people would have held on to these as keepsakes and remembrances of the late president. And then here we actually have a copy of the timetable that was used for President Lincoln's funeral train as it traveled between Rochester and Buffalo, and stopped made passes through many stations, and Batavia being one of them, but it also stopped in Bergen, West Bergen, Byron, Corfu, and Crofts Corners. So it's passed through many stations in Genesee County on its way between Rochester and Buffalo. And then finally here we have a picture of what the station looked like along with the locomotive, the Dean Richmond that pulled it. Well, I'd like to thank everyone for watching this video, and hopefully you enjoyed learning more about the connections between our 16th President Abraham Lincoln and our local area here. If you have missed any of our previous videos, please go back and check them out. They're on our channel, Holland Land Office Museum, as well as on our other social media platforms. And we'll be making these in the future, so I hope you stick around and watch them as we go forward.